Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we will turn the floor over to our esteemed opening keynote speaker. First, we would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors, Zoom and Rubrik. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. We also welcome you to stay socially connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please use the hashtag ArgyleDigital and follow us on Twitter at ArgyleExecForum. Also be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I would also like to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we have curated based on the feedback we have received over the years from our members. We have worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we truly appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we would love to hear from you. So during each session, we encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box on your screen. Following each presentation, we have set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Thank you again for joining us. Now let's get started. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Christopher Friends, Information Security Officer and AVP of IT Security at Mount Sinai South Nassau. We are excited to have Christopher with us for his opening keynote titled Achieving Evidence-Based Security with Threat-Informed Defense. Welcome, Christopher, and over to you.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. One of the things we see in recent years in the security industry is kind of a disturbing trend. We have cybersecurity spending at an all-time high, and yet we still see security incidents and data breaches going up. Healthcare has been particularly hard hit in this area, with many of the ransomware attacks that have targeted hospitals in recent years actually impacting patient care. When ransomware strikes a healthcare organization, it brings down systems and services, and anything that results in the loss of availability has the potential to lead to a delay in patient care, which in turn can lead to adverse outcomes for patients, as seen by many news stories in recent years. So cybersecurity is becoming increasingly important, not just to protect data, but to protect individuals as well. And within healthcare, there are many challenges that could contribute to conditions like this. For example, healthcare does suffer from a shortage of security talent. It does suffer from a lot of legacy equipment that does have many vulnerabilities which have the potential to impact patient care, as well as often the premature overconnectivity of devices, in which devices were rapidly put online to meet meaningful use standards with little regard for the security of those devices. So while there are many challenges within healthcare that could be contributing to this surge in breaches and ransomware attacks, these problems are not necessarily unique to healthcare. And one of the issues that I see heavily within the security world today is that we have an over-focus on compliance alone. Now, one of the things I think is very important to stress for an organization is that compliance can be a component of security, but compliance and security are not necessarily the same thing. You have many organizations that are concerned with compliance, but they want to stop there. And in my opinion, compliance should never be viewed as the end goal. Compliance should set the minimum benchmark for what you're trying to achieve, because you can easily reach a state in which you can be heavily compliant with something, but still be insecure. I kind of view shooting for compliance as kind of trying like for a D grade in a class. You may check all the boxes, you may pass the class, but just because you checked all the boxes, it does not necessarily mean that you're doing a good job. And I think it's coming time for organizations to begin to move away from compliance-based approaches alone and consider a more evidence-based approach towards information security. I think as security professionals, we need to not just be concerned with checking boxes, but actually finding ways of quantitatively measuring the security that we put in place, actually seeing what controls work, what controls don't work, and making decisions increasingly based on empirical data. We need to stop assuming that just because we deployed a control, it's going to be effective against a cyber attack, and actually take the time to test the controls we have to ensure their efficacy. I think we increasingly need to develop better metrics around security that actually make a lot of the changes we make to our environment more and more quantifiable. I think a lot of the metrics we use today, while not without value, are often not fine-grained enough to actually measure a lot of the security needs organizations have. Take something like KRIs or KPIs, which are a very common way to measure security today. They definitely have value, but let's take an example of mean time to detection. Yes, it's great to measure mean time to detection for an incident. It's great to have a goal of improving your mean time to detection. But if you look at why a lot of organizations fail with measurements such as detecting an incident, it's often because they don't have the ability to detect all of the tactics and techniques that attackers like to use in the first place. So I think we often need to take a step back and look at more fine-grained ways of developing metrics in order to improve a lot of security outcomes. And that's something we're going to go to more in depth a little bit in the presentation. At the end of the day, it's time for security to become much more of an art form and much less of, much more of a science and much less of an art form. And I think that taking these more quantitative approaches and moving away from just checklist-based approaches is critical. If we look back at a compliance-based approach, you may have a compliance requirement to deploy a firewall. Now, checking a box and deploying a firewall is one thing, but just being compliant does not assure that you have the firewall properly configured, that you're doing proper egress filtering, you have DNS properly locked down, and all of the other proper configurations present in that firewall. If we take more evidence-based approaches and test for the efficacy of the firewall, it exposes whether we have those proper configurations in place or not. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Before we go into some of the threat-informed defense approaches and evidence-based approaches I like to utilize, I want to touch on a concept called the pyramid of pain. Now, the pyramid of pain was released a number of years ago, and what it says is that the higher up you go, up the pyramid you go, in terms of the controls that you have in place, the more effective those controls are. So if we have a control like traditional antivirus, which blocks things based on hash value, it's really trivial for an attacker to bypass that control because you can change a single character in a file and it changes the hash value of the file, and now that control can be bypassed. Same thing with IP addresses, they're relatively easy to change. And as you work your way up the pyramid, it becomes harder and harder for an attacker to make changes to that. If you force an attacker to start to change the tool sets they use, or even more effectively, the tactics and techniques that they choose to use, it becomes very difficult for an attacker to bypass those controls. So one of the things I really like to focus on is to take a look at all the various tactics and techniques that attackers like to use, and use that as a basis for taking more evidence-based approaches. And to do that, I like to turn to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. What the MITRE ATT&CK framework does is it lists out all the various tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been observed in data breaches and other cyber attacks in recent years. And it gives you a real starting point for looking at what protections you may need within your organization, because these are all tactics and techniques observed in real attacks, and they give you a feel for the ways your organization is likely to be targeted. Particularly if you do MITRE ATT&CK mapping, where you take a look at some of the various groups, such as ransomware for healthcare, that tend to target your industry vertical, and you can identify the TTPs that are most relevant to your organization, and use that as a way to really begin to drill down and say, will my controls work against these TTPs? Now, in order to take this more evidence-based approach at a high level, I like to first do a quantitative risk assessment to identify the threats. So for example, in healthcare, I may identify ransomware and various ransomware actors as a threat that I'm likely to face. I then like to take a look at the TTPs that threat group is likely to use and use that as a way to develop metrics that will allow me to quantify the impact that threat can have on my organization, to metrics to measure the efficacy of the various controls I have within the organization, as well as metrics to measure the efficacy of my incident response process. How efficiently are the people in my organization responding to a particular incident? Can they detect the incident? To ask various questions like that. Then, once I have those metrics in place, I like to develop a way to simulate that particular threat. So I take a look at the TTPs the attacker leverages and find ways to simulate those particular TTPs, sometimes using the actual tools attackers use, sometimes using more harmless simulations, but figure out a way to actually test those TTPs against my environment. I then like to run those simulations and use those simulations to collect those particular metrics, to actually go and measure the security I have in place, see what worked, see what didn't work. And then I take the data that was collected, analyze the metrics, and use it to identify areas in which the organization can improve. And we'll go through some examples of this in a second. I then like to make remediations to the environment, and then, because it's a cycle, go back and repeat the process. Simulate the threat again, and actually see if post-remediation, I'm actually scoring better on the metrics I developed than I was prior to those remediations. To actually find a way to empirically show that the changes I made to the organization are actually improving the security of the organization. And taking this approach is increasingly what's becoming known as taking a threat-informed defense approach. Looking at the various TTPs and real-world attacks that your organization is likely to see, and using that to help to identify control gaps and areas that need to be remediated. I think it's really critical to do this because I think it's time that as an organization, we begin to leverage threat intelligence in a way that allows us to look beyond just IOCs. IOCs like IP addresses and hashes, they're not valueless, but as going back to the pyramid of pain, as it clearly shows, controls that target at that level can relatively be easily bypassed. What I instead like to do is to map those IOCs to the various TTPs that they were trying to accomplish and begin to test and develop controls that work at that level. And we'll see some examples of those in a second. I'm a big fan of using breach and attack simulation, as I kind of already alluded to. And breach and attack simulations are a great way to ensure that controls are actually effectively implemented within the organization, because we can test playbooks for these various threats against the controls we have, measure their efficacy, and use that to see how well our controls actually work or don't work, and make remediations accordingly. Breach and attack simulations, I think, are a really good way to do this. One is they provide a way to automate a lot of the testing. So if organizations without a really robust red team, they can be a great way to run a lot of these simulations. And while some organizations do pen testing to achieve similar, one of the issues with pen testing is pen testing are often a single point in time. So you run a pen test and it might be months or a year before you run a pen test again, depending on how frequently your organization does it. But with breach and attack simulation systems, they provide the ability to do more continuous validation. You can run these kinds of scans regularly as new threat actors and new playbooks come out with new sets of TTPs. You can take an update to your BAS system and you can run the simulations again. You can kind of continually stay up to date with what the current attacker playbooks are and test your defenses against them. So I'm really, really big on beginning to measure security like this. Now, some examples of some of the control improvements I've made over the years using breach and attack simulation. Some of these are geared towards ransomware, but one of the things, we'll walk through this example in depth, is that of network segmentation. Doing a lot of these breach and attack simulations, you will really see the need for network segmentation, and very fine-grained network segmentation at that. These types of simulations will also point out things like how to better secure a PowerShell. Like, for example, we did a lot of testing of various EDRs with a breach and attack simulation system. And one of the things we found is that the EDR software that we utilized was not able to consistently stop PowerShell 2 fallback attacks. So one of the hardening remediations we made to the environment was we disabled PowerShell 2 support across the organization, because while the EDR software had the ability to deal with PowerShell-based threats, it didn't consistently deal with that particular type of PowerShell-based threat. And we improved the ability to lock that down. We've done a lot of tuning of our EDR software, a lot of tuning of our XDR software. We've done a lot of tuning of our SIM alerting to ensure that we can actually detect various threats. So whereby we'll actually run a simulation and we'll ask the question, did we detect the TTPs in a way that was efficient? Did we detect everything we needed to detect? And if we didn't, we use that to build custom detections to improve our ability to detect certain threats. Done a lot of tuning over the years of firewalls to ensure that command and control communication is blocked. We're not downloading malware. Proper egress filtering is in place. And these are just the tip of the iceberg of things you can identify using simulations like this to improve your security. Now, one of the ways I want to talk about as an example of using these breach and attack simulations actually goes back to 2015. It was my first foray into breach and attack simulation. And I think it's a relatively easy example for organizations to implement, but I think one that holds a lot of value. So back in 2015, a hospital hadn't yet seen a ransomware attack. It wasn't until 2017 that a ransomware attack actually hit Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital for the first time. But regardless, the organization I worked at the time was very concerned over the possibility of a ransomware attack hitting a hospital. So one of the things is we decided to do is actually sit down and figure out a way that we could simulate what would happen if a ransomware attack were to actually hit the organization. And in order to do this simulation, we made use of what's called the ICAR test file. For anybody unfamiliar with it, it's that strange string of characters in the middle of the slide that has ICAR standard antivirus test file in the middle. And it's a harmless string of characters. It won't actually do anything other than print ICAR standard antivirus test file to the screen if you execute it. But the interesting thing about this file is that years and years ago, all the AV makers got together and agreed to treat this particular file as a virus. So it kind of provides a safe but effective way to test AV and other security controls within the organization. So we use this as the basis of conducting a attack simulation of ransomware spreading through the organization to see both how our controls would respond, as well as how people within the organization would respond. So in order to do this, we wrote a Perl script that took a list of all the computers in the organization, and the Perl script was set up to copy the ICAR test file to each PC on the list and execute the file in an attempt to set off the AV. And one of the interesting things we did, because I'm also big on testing not just the controls, but also the people that have to work with and respond to the virus alerts, the script was executed without the knowledge of any other staff members in the organization. It was only myself, the CIO, and the CEO of the organization who knew we were doing this test to make it as real world as possible. And you can kind of see, here's when the script is starting to run. This was a screenshot of the antivirus console that we had used at the time. And you can start to see all these virus and spyware alerts pop up on various PCs within the organization. Now, from doing this exercise, we learned a lot of interesting things. Some of the good things that we learned was that IT staff members were able to identify the source of the outbreak. They were able to track it down, remove it from the network, which was nice to see. And we learned that many of our in-place security features actually stopped the spread of the infection to parts of the network. So for example, network segmentation, which we had using ACLs between VLANs, mostly segmentation by department at the time, was actually very effective at keeping the threat contained. So that was a security control that worked. And one we'll come back to in a minute. So just keep in mind that it worked, but there is a caveat to that. And another example was the security configurations of our VDI desktops. Turns out we had two different engineers configure the image for our VDI desktops versus our physical desktops. And the VDI desktop image turned out to be more resistant to the attack than the physical desktop image. So we're actually able to compare the hardening configurations of both desktop images and use that to further improve our security. Now, there was obviously some bad things that you learned too, because not everything works. And one of the things we learned is that while the incident was detected, there were a number of things that we could have done to really improve how we detected, how quickly we detected, and how we responded to the incident. So there was a lot of avenues identified that we could have improved from a timing perspective. And going back in 2015, security was much less of a concern in hospitals. And one of the things that was really interesting to see was that you had all these AV prompts going off on all these doctors and nurses' PCs, and not one doctor or nurse actually picked up the phone to actually call somebody in IT. So it really pointed out the need for additional training for staff for security awareness. So to kind of recap some of the lessons learned was we did some things like update the configuration of our AV software to make outbreaks more noticeable to the IT staff. We did a lot of internal training, both with IT and security staff, as well as the general employee population to improve security awareness and incident response time. And one of the things I really want to focus on, though, is I made the point earlier that our network segmentation was effective. But one of the really great things that came out of doing this incident and measuring it was that we learned that network segmentation was an effective control. But by doing the simulation, we also learned that the network segmentation we had was nowhere near fine-grained enough. And this goes back to the point I made earlier between the difference between compliance and security. Going back to 2015, very few hospitals had any network segmentation at all. By having network segmentation, we were not only compliant, we were actually more than compliant when compared to most other hospitals at the time. But when we actually tested our defenses using this more evidence-based approach, we really learned of the deficiency that our setup actually had. We were segmented by department. And while the simulation showed that the segmentation by department was effective at keeping an incident contained to a single department, one of the things that we learned from doing this was that if we were to lose our entire emergency room or our entire radiology department as a hospital, it was still going to be disastrous to hospital operations. So while we had an effective control, while we were compliant, we were not effective to the level the organization actually needed to satisfy its needs. So this was actually one of the things that got us going down the journey towards zero trust. Now, zero trust, for anybody who's interested, is that basically enforces the creation of a perimeter around every network-enabled device to ensure that only pre-approved traffic flows are allowed. If the traffic is not required for the device to function, that traffic should be blocked by default. Now, zero trust and the high level of network segmentation they provide are a really great control against ransomware and a lot of other types of cyber attacks, because they really work to keep an incident contained. If two systems don't have the ability to communicate with each other, it's very hard for that attack vector to spread from between those two systems. Now, this is an example of some of the zero trust policies we have in place. So one of the things that we did early on was we made it so that our workstations, like the various desktops and laptops within the organization, could not communicate with each other. Because while a typical doctor or nurse's PCs has a need to communicate with our electronic health record servers or our PACS servers for medical images, it's extremely rare for there to be a need outside of like help desk type support for any two PCs within the organization to actually need to communicate with each other. So one of the things that we did was, as a very early initiative, was we restricted the ability for workstations to actually communicate with each other. So here's one of the early cuts we made in terms of network traffic flows. And if you see the diagram on the top left-hand corner, that was the pre-segmentation phase, where all of those red lines represented a large number of traffic flows going back and forth between various devices. And after we put network segmentation policies in place, you can see we greatly reduced the number of traffic flows possible by cutting off that inter-workstation communication. And over time, we've added additional policies for servers, made the segmentation increasingly granular over time, because zero trust really is kind of a journey. And but I want to focus more on the breach and attack simulation. So we worked hard to segment the network. We got a lot of those policies in place based on the tests we did. And then, because once again, I'm big on quantifying the improvement, really showing how we improve the organization, we repeated the breach and attack simulation again using the ICAR test string. And this time, one of the things of interest that we discovered was that only the server that we launched the script from was this time impacted by the ICAR test string. None of the other workstations or servers were impacted because of the segmentation policies we put in place. But one of the things I want to highlight is that you always want to continually test with new scenarios. Yes, we did that one scenario. Yes, it was successful, but we've done other breach and attack simulations since then. And one of the things that we didn't think of locking down during that initial phase that a later simulation pointed out when we simulated the Pony ransomware was that they do data exfiltration over ICMP. So one of the things that we had left open was we allowed devices to ping each other for troubleshooting purposes. When we ran the scenario, we learned that that could be used to exfiltrate data. And now to reduce that risk, we've developed a set of identity-based policies that restrict the ability to ping a device to just workstations belonging to IT staff to further improve our security and address that risk. And this is kind of the point I was making earlier of continuous validation, continuous testing. Never assume your security is secure. Always go back and test against new threats, and you'll find additional ways of improving your security. All of this really highlights the need for a defense in-depth approach. Even zero trust, while it's a great security control, it's not perfect. Don't assume you're secure. Actually go and test. You'll find ways to bypass pretty much any tool if you test enough. No tool is perfect. And one of the keys is to identify all of the weaknesses that your tools have and figure out how you can put compensating controls around that. Just a really quick thing to end on before I get to questions is I do want to discuss a real world medical device incident I once saw. And it also highlights why a lot of this testing and a lot of these policies are very important, because your perimeter is going to be breached at some point in all kinds of interesting ways, and oftentimes in ways that you might not expect. We had a case at a hospital I worked at where we had an X-ray machine in the hospital fail. And unbeknownst to us, the company that was responsible for repairing the machine didn't have the original install disks to actually reinstall the software. But they maintained the same X-ray machine at a hospital within the same region. And one of the things they did without telling anybody in IT or IT security was they cloned the other hospital's X-ray machine's hard drive in order to restore our X-ray machine to service. Now, as soon as they did this, they brought the machine back online. A few minutes later, our DNS sinkhole and other controls start going off because we had really tuned those detections. And the network segmentation kept the threat from spreading anywhere, so it was a non-issue for us. But one of the things we learned is that the X-ray machine that they had cloned was infected with the configure virus. So because of our testing and everything else, we were able to detect it and prevent it right away. It was not a non-issue. It just made for a very interesting call to another hospital for us. But it really showed how your perimeter is going to be breached in all kinds of ways you may not expect. And taking the time to do these simulations, test your controls both internally and not just at the perimeter, is a really valuable exercise to do, and why this is worth doing. And at this point, I'll happily take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, for such an insightful presentation. We had quite a few questions come through. We'll go ahead and review a few. This first question, how do you recommend introducing these concepts to an organization?
I like to start simple. There's a lot of very simple things you can measure. Like, for example, something like the egress filtering of your firewall. There's a service called allports.exposed. You can easily run something like an nmap scan against that, and you can show what you're blocking, what you're not blocking. Really simple TTPs like that are kind of the way to start. And as you get more comfortable simulating threats like that, with simple cases like that, you can gradually build over time to more complex cases. Once you get kind of comfortable, though, I would really focus on what threats are most relevant to your particular industry vertical. And in my experience, it's actually not that hard to sell, because I've had, at least from my perspective, a lot of board acceptance over the years for doing this stuff, because it's really nice to show the board that, we had, let's say, I'm just making numbers up here. Let's say we were 50% able to stop the ransomware tactics, but we made these 3 control changes, and now we're able to stop 85% of their tactics. And that goes a long way towards showing how you're actually improving a security organization, and it really helps you get buy-in for additional initiatives.
Great, thank you. This next question, what tools help with achieving evidence-based security?
I'm very big on breach and attack simulation systems. So there are a number of vendors that provide those services. We use AttackIQ, but there are a number of other vendors. If you're looking to not spend any money, as a free way to do it, MITRE offers Caldera, which is a Linux distribution designed for breach and attack simulation. It's not quite as user-friendly as some of the third-party systems, but that exists. There's also a system called Infection Monkey from a company called Guardicore, which does some breach and attack simulation as well. But internally, we use the AttackIQ platform, supplemented with some own internal red teaming skills.
Great, thank you, Chris. Looks like we have time for one last question. How did you apply network segmentation?
Okay, that's actually a big question. What we did is, I've actually done it a couple of different ways. I've done this at multiple hospitals now, but my advice for network segmentation is it's really several phases. One, first phase is going to be asset inventory, which a lot of organizations have challenges with, identifying what's on the network. The second phase is going to be, once you've identified what's in the network, doing the traffic studies to identify how all those devices talk to each other. That's going to be where you want to spend the most time. The more time you spend doing the traffic studies, the better your rules are going to be, the less you're going to break when you roll things out. So spend the bulk of your time doing those traffic studies. Then when it comes time to applying rules, don't try to do the whole environment as once. Consider it more of a process, more of a journey, than something that you're going to just flip a switch and suddenly be zero trust. break it up into manageable chunks. Do some of the easy systems first. Do things like your DHCP server, your DNS server. Network engineers know the ports and protocols inside and out for that. The chance of missing something or breaking something is going to be very slim because of that. That lets you get familiar with the new tools you're introducing to the organization. So do the real low-hanging, real simple fruit first. After we did the real simple stuff like that to get a feel for the tools, we moved on to doing the workstations next. The rationale for me doing workstations is, if you look at how a lot of attacks will occur, it's still through phishing and other stuff. So one of the most likely entry points to your organization is still going to be the workstations. And even as a first cut, in most organizations, workstations need to talk to servers, workstations don't need to talk to each other. So you can typically get rid of the inter-workstation communication pretty easily. That results in a fairly big security improvement. The other thing is workstations tend to be clones of each other. You might have several different types of workstations, but once you figure out a set of policies that works for one type of workstation, you can usually use that to cover a large number of assets at once. I would then recommend moving on to systems that are high risk and save systems that you consider complex and low risk for last. And like I said, don't expect it to be instant. Break the environment up into manageable chunks. You may even want to make certain, different cuts for systems. Do cuts that are increasingly granular over time. But that's kind of the key, is to do the in-depth traffic studies and to not bite off too much at once. Do it in smaller pieces and use that to avoid breaking stuff.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for such an insightful keynote. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event.